Race, diversity, immigration, and free speech. They are among the most debated topics of our time, with the power to divide friends, families, even nations. It doesn't have to be so, according to University of California law professor John A. Powell. He is director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at UC Berkeley, and he joins us now. It's a pleasure to meet you.
It's good to meet you, Steve.
Thanks for making some time for us here. I want to start with something just sort of a little offbeat. I know you get this all the time, but this will come as news to our viewers. Sheldon, can you bring Professor Powell's super up, please? Okay, there we go. That is not a misprint. Your name is spelled in all lowercase letters. Tell us why.
It's an interesting story, a long story. In the 60s, when I was coming of age, African Americans were changing their names, was reclaiming the African names, shedding their slave names. And I thought of doing the same, being influenced by a number of people. And so I started looking for African names. I was also becoming aware of what I call that people were decentered in the universe. That is, that we weren't the center of the universe. And so the idea was reconnecting with my ancestors, my past. And my mom was very distraught by the idea. I was named after her father. And she said the name was good enough for him and it was good enough for me. And even in my young, sort of high vinegar days as a youth, it struck me as odd to be alienating my parents to connect with my ancestors. And then I also was reading E. Cummings. So I just,
who does the same thing?
Yeah.
Lowercase e, lowercase e.
That's right. Although he actually apparently didn't do it, his publicist did it. Huh. I didn't find that out till later. But then I said, well, what if I drop the caps? And she said, I don't care about that as long as you keep the name. So that's how it happened.
That was a happy compromise.
Yeah.
And does it make, all these years later, does it still make the statement that you wanted it to make back then?
Well, it's interesting. My daughter, my oldest child, I watched her years ago, maybe 20 years ago, I watched her sign something, and she signed her last name, Powell, with a lower P. And I said, Sunita, what's that about? And she said, that's my name. And I'd never discussed it with her. So to some extent, it's just become my name. And although I think the instincts, certainly in terms of humans, in that sense, I'm not a humanist, not being the center of the universe, is really an important statement still to make.
So she picked that up on her own?
She picked it up on her own.
Interesting. I want to take a look at the state of the world today, if I can, through your eyes, because the issues that we referred to in the introduction are omnipresent and for many people extremely troubling. We seem to be more anxious about these issues today than we have been in the past. Do you know why?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. Basically the world is speeding up. Tom Friedman, in a book he wrote called Thanks for Being Late, he talks about living in accelerated change. And I think those change happen along at least 4 dimensions: globalization, technology, the environment, and migration. And what that really means is that people are changing, that who we are collectively is changing. And people can only process so much change in a short period of time without it creating anxiety. And that anxiety can take on different forms. One of the forms is a more pernicious form, which I call breaking, which is that somehow the other is threatening our existentialist being, who we are as a people. It may be threatening some other areas as well in terms of our economy. And the other one is bridging. And which of those stories become dominant depends on leaders and stories and narratives. And so what we have is breaking stories being told all around the world. And the liberal response to try to slow this down is not very effective, because basically we say, okay, there are a lot of people coming to Canada or the United States or Germany or England, or there are a lot of people in India who are not Hindus. But the liberal response is they're just like us. And that's not people's lived experience. And so the response is not a response at all. So it actually, in a sense, we have very few effective responses to the breaking stories.
So those folks marching with those torches in Charlottesville, they clearly don't see that they have anything in common at all with the people that they are railing against. You can't tell they're not, you can't say to them, they're just like us.
Yes, and remember what they were saying, the Jews will not replace us. And so they were literally expressing an existentialist threat, saying, as the country changes, I'm going to change. And again, the liberal response is, no, the Jews are just like you. Gays are just like straight people. Blacks are just like whites. Muslims are just like Christians. And that's not the right answer. So I've written about this and talk about it, and I say the challenge to this issue of what I call othering is not saming, it's belonging. But as we sort of watch countries from the Southern Hemisphere increasingly move north, which we're seeing throughout Europe, and we'll see even more with climate change, it's going to put a stress on a lot of our, not just political institutions, but our sense of who we are. We're becoming something different.
When you say we're becoming something different, I mean, the people carrying those torches are not becoming something different. They're trying to, it seems to me, hang on to what they've always been.
Well, you're right and you're wrong. Because who they were is made up. So when Trump talks about making America great again, or when people, any of these right-wing nationalists, usually ethnic or racial nationalists, talk about the past, it's a made-up past. It says, let's go back to when. And in the United States, they did a survey, and some people said 1850, when slavery was still in place. Some people said 1900s, when the United States was an emerging imperialist power. No one said beyond 1950s. So they had this image of when America was white, Protestant, males dominated, we ruled the earth, not just the United States. After World War II, 60% of the economy in the world was in the United States. We're not going back to that time. And in a sense, that time never was. The United States never was a white country. They forget about there were native people when they got there. The United States has always struggled to become something. So yes, it's not, they have an image of going back to a period of time and stopping history. Now, I talked about 4 things generating this anxiety. So there hasn't been a march against technology. There hasn't been a march against robots. There hasn't been a march against artificial intelligence. There have been marches about climate, but the changes are happening. The world's not going to go backwards. And climate change is going to create more stress in terms of people from the South moving north. And the way we did in the world, colonialism and imperialism was in the South, extracting things to the North. Those processes are actually now being replicated in people's lives. The past was never really the past. The question, can we make a future that belongs to all of us?
Before we get to that question, I do want to follow up on one thing. Okay, so migration, patterns of migration, and those others that are coming here, I understand from your explanation why some people are worried about that. Do they not see that robotics and artificial intelligence and automation are equally, if not more, responsible for eliminating that past that they so misunderstand and cherish?
No, I don't think so. I think for most people, even as they claim that they want to go back to the past, they'll be on the internet, they'll be into social media, they'll have their smartphone. And so most people just think of that as a background. But you're right, I think the technological change, and all these things interrelated, is actually in some ways more change producing. And the reality is Canada, the United States, Europe, I mean, you go to London, you go to here in Toronto, it's a very diverse city. And I think that's a good thing if done well. And it's not just diverse in terms of people being here. I live in California. There's a concept called interfamilies, where one member of the family is of a different race or a different ethnicity. By some projection, that number will hit close to 50% of new families by 2025.
In your part of California?
In California, the state of California.
In all of California.
And California is the future of the United States. So we're seeing that something's happening. And I read in Canada the numbers of interfamilies in the last 10 years is up almost 40%. So it's happening here. And so people come together and they make new people. They affect each other. They influence each other, not just in terms of food and language, our sensibilities, but in terms of love, in terms of religion. So people are always, cultures are always forming. They're never static.
Well, let me follow up now on the othering that you talked about. And we certainly see examples of, for example, in Charlottesville, those angry white people othering Jews, blacks, gays, whoever. I wonder whether it happens even within ethnic groups. Do Orthodox Jews other Reform Jews, to highly educated, upper class African Americans, other, blacks who live in the ghetto, so to speak. I guess take any ethnic group you want.
Sure.
Does that kind of othering happen?
It happens all the time. It happens at different levels. It happens interpersonally. It happens individually. It happens at a state level, institutional level. Yes, blacks, other blacks. In the United States, sometimes there's a fight about, well, maybe blacks from the Caribbean are not the same as blacks who were born in the United States, or blacks from Nigeria, or as you say, rich blacks and poor blacks. So othering happens all over the place.
Even by nice progressive people.
Even by nice progressive people. The issue of categorization seems to be pretty hardwired into the human mind, but the way we categorize, how hard those categories are, how fluid they are, is completely social. So as for people in the West, it's like Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims. They're both Muslims. Catholics and Protestants, they're both Christian. So yeah, we find all kinds of ways to other. Now that's the bad news. The good news, though, is that we also find ways of coming together.
How?
Well, think about this. Canada's a huge country, I think the second largest country in the world.
Landmass.
Landmass, right. So most of the people here think of themselves as Canadian. That wasn't true 100 years ago. They're coming from different places. They weren't all Canadians. You had a bump in the 70s and 80s as to what was going to happen with Quebec. Maybe that's still happening. The same is true of any country. When France became a country, most of the people didn't speak French and didn't think of themselves as French. That's a history that most people don't remember. If you think about the United States, in the 1920s, most people who all consider themselves white now would not have considered themselves white. That would not have been their salient identity. They would have been German American, Italian American, French American, and there wasn't much interaction, there wasn't much intermarriage, and that changed very fast.
But those distinctions seem very irrelevant right now.
That's my point.
Yeah.
And so people constantly are reconstructing who's the we. And they tend to do it, it's not uneven, but they tend to do it in a way that the we keeps getting larger. I'll give you one last example. There are about 2 billion people in the world who identify as Christian. About 1.2 billion of them identify as Catholic. So 1.2 billion people scattered around the world think they have something in common. That's kind of amazing.
I want to put some information that you folks at the Haas Institute have done. You surveyed Californians and their views on identity, race, and politics. And Sheldon, if you would, let's bring up these graphics right now. You did this towards the end of last year. 68% of respondents supported race-conscious policies, such as affirmative action. 66% rejected the idea that the U.S.-Mexico border wall is an important immigration policy priority. 66% said it's important to take in refugees from Muslim countries where people are trying to escape war and violence. 49% supported banning people from majority Muslim countries from entering the U.S. About a quarter said increasing deportations is very important. And another just over a third said such a policy is somewhat important. It looks like there's quite a few contradictions in here. So how do we explain all this?
Well, the simple way of explaining it is that people are complicated. And we have multiple what they call sites, sometimes referred to as schemas, sometimes referred to as selves. We have multiple selves inside of us. John Rawls actually talks about diversity as being an internal as well as an external project. And by that, he meant that we have diverse parts of ourselves, and they don't always align. And sometimes they directly contradict. And so, and people, what's interesting, if you're going back to California in the 1990s, these numbers would have been very different. It's a new California. And it's not just because they're new people. California is changing. And so people living close to each other. California is one of the most diverse states in the United States, along with Hawaii. We have no racial majority. The largest single racial ethnic groups are Latinos. So this is the fearful future that Trump and others are worried about, but yet California is the 5th largest economy in the world if it was a freestanding nation. Most people think California is pretty cool. That's the home of a lot of tech companies. So the diversity that lives in California has not created this sort of degeneration or the collapse of the economy or the collapse of civilization that people worry about.
UC Berkeley was a hotbed of free speech 50 years ago. It's a little different today, and I want to go into an example here from the New Yorker magazine, the notion that free speech is a principle that should be defended at all costs in a democratic society. Here's what went on at Berkeley. Milo Yiannopoulos convinced his supporters that he should be a poster child for campus free speech, a principle that is universally lauded in theory but vexingly thorny in practice. In the 2017-18 academic year, Politico reported, an unusually large number of universities struggled, quote, to balance their commitment to free speech, which has been challenged by alt-right supporters of President Donald Trump, with campus safety. One expert on campus called this the #1 topic of the year. Okay, before we dive into this, do you want to give us a bit of background here on when Milo tried to speak at Berkeley and what happened thereafter?
Well, he was scheduled to speak initially, and there were protests and demonstration, and the university canceled it. And then
because he's an alt-right-wing kind of guy.
Yeah, not just that. He was actually there was a case that just went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and one of the justices in her dissent talked about weaponizing speech, and in a sense, she was saying, let's not be naive. The people, you know, I was the legal director at the ACLU for almost 10 years, so I care a lot about free speech. But free speech is a complicated set of concepts. It's not one thing. Every country, including Canada, has a much more robust way of actually what we call regulating hate speech than the United States does. There are always exceptions. For example, the classic one is you can't yell fire in a movie theater, dark movie theater. Another one, though, people don't talk about very much, is the Me Too movement. Almost, you know, and so certainly there's bullying and inappropriate sexual advances being made against women and others. Sometimes it's just verbal. No one's defended that as just free speech. Mm-hmm. No one has said, I have a right to ask the woman to have sex in the workplace. What's wrong with that? So going back to Milo came back, and the university felt like we had to receive him. And he ended up coming back and not having a big demonstration. He sort of self-removed him. He didn't get a lot of support. But the right wing was very deliberate, not just with Milo, but sending a number of provocateurs to Berkeley to really try to stir things up.
But I mean, I do have to ask you, Berkeley in particular, but university campuses in general, are, I think, supposed to be places where, you know, a collision of ideas can take place. And it feels today like on too many university campuses, that's not allowed anymore.
Well, I think we're in a different place for sure, but I don't think it's quite as dire as you suggest. So speech is not just words, they're also acts. In the United States, there was an important case called Citizens United, where the Supreme Court overturned 100 years of case law, basically saying money could be used, money was speech.
Money is speech.
And you could use money to fund any candidate, including corporate money. That's very inconsistent with 150 years of U.S. jurisprudence. And it created quite an uproar. So is money speech or is money not speech? Is corporate money speech? Is corporate money not speech? There used to be such a thing as advertisement, where government could regulate advertisement, but not political speech.
But that's not the kind of speech I'm talking about.
But my point is that the concept is actually a complicated concept. And I try to set this out in an article, as well as in the article that you mentioned. The idea of speech, the foundation for speech in the West, really comes largely from the writing and thinking of Mills. And Mill's idea was that there were what he called self-regarding acts and other regarding acts. And the self-regarding acts is things that I do that doesn't affect anyone else. And other regarding acts are things that affect other people. And he said the government had no business being involved in self-regarding acts. He considered speech a self-regarding act because he assumed that speech could not injure. We actually learned that he's wrong.
Speech can injure.
Speech can injure. And some people say, well, but speech, he's talking about physical acts versus non-physical acts. We've actually learned that speech actually can constitute a physical act. Now, this is science. This is science, 21st century science. So once we say that speech can injure, so what Mills said about other regarding acts, he didn't say you outlaw them all, but he said you don't have individual rights to other regarding acts. Those are social rights. Like, for example, if you drive a gasoline using car, it's actually hurting the environment. But we still let you drive it. But that's not a right that you have. You don't have a right to drive a gasoline producing car. Socially, we come to the decision that it's important, it serves some benefit, we're going to put up with the pollution. Maybe we should not.
Well, tell me whether you think the, who was it there? Which festival? The New Yorker again. Okay, New Yorker had that festival in which they invited and then disinvited Steve Bannon, because I think they thought the pollution coming out of his mouth was a little too much to handle. Should they have disinvited him?
Well, Steve, the thing is, and I've talked about this a lot, I think the foundation for us understanding free speech in these discussions is actually too thin. I'm not saying what falls on one side or the other. I'm saying we need a principled way of understanding it, and the principled way that we've been using for the last 100 years in terms of some things injure and some things don't no longer holds. If it injures, and Steve Bannon may injure, Milo may injure, I'm not saying you ban them, but I'm saying then you have a discussion as to why you would allow this. Now, the free speech in the 60s that you made reference to at Berkeley was largely against the government. This is quite different. We're in a different time. And I would say, from my perspective, being at Berkeley and in the country, the defining issue in the country today, and I say in the world, is this issue about othering, this issue about telling some people they don't belong, that they're not human, the kind of fragmentation and violence that's happening all around the world. And I think speech, the weaponized speech, is just one aspect of that.
Having said that, Malcolm Gladwell, good Canadian kid, tweeted the following when the invitation to Steve Bannon was rescinded by the New Yorker. He said, call me old-fashioned, but I would have thought that the point of a festival of ideas was to expose the audience to ideas. If you only invite your friends over, it's called a dinner party. Is he onto something there?
I think it's too facile.
Well, it is Twitter.
Yeah, but you know, he writes books. He's not limited to Twitter. And we're dealing with complicated issues. And part of the platform, Twitter may not be the proper platform to deal with complicated issues. So one of the things that Milo wanted to do was to expose students at Berkeley who are undocumented. Now, that's not an idea. That's basically saying to ICE, come and get these people. That's saying these people are not safe, they don't belong in our country, get them out of here. And so now the New Yorker, they can invite or uninvite whoever they want to. That's their prerogative. So if we really talk about free speech, which in the United States is also associated with association, it doesn't mean I have to invite the guy who believes the Holocaust didn't exist and the guy who believed the Holocaust did to have a debate. Not every idea has to be present at every conversation.
Oh, I get you.
And yes, you do want a robust set of ideas. But when people protest Bannon and when people protest Milo, you know what they're doing? They're exercising their free speech. That's part of the mix. And so it doesn't mean free speech is not just a polite conversation. It's like saying, okay, we're trying to do something in a political, cultural context, and there are going to be disagreements. And sometimes it's going to have to be organized. So I don't think, I don't feel bad for Bannon, and I don't, you know, if I have a dinner party, you're invited.
Thank you, I will accept the invitation. But you won't mind me arguing with you a little bit.
I don't mind
either.
at all, but I would not invite Bannon. So it doesn't mean every time we have a dinner party, in order for us to have a lively debate, and I wouldn't even say with Bannon it's not a debate. It's bantering, it's something else. He's not, and so, again, I think that these things should be discussed in much more sophisticated ways. The whole famous trial in the United States of the Skokie trial of the Nazis marching through Illinois, where Holocaust survivors had, and this is the ACLU defended the case. I question that, because I think it was not about a conversation, it was to inflict an injury. And now we know that they probably did inflict an injury. Should they be allowed? Let's have a discussion about that. But it's not a black and white case as far as I'm concerned.
Professor Powell, you would fit in Canada quite well. Your ideas about free speech, I think, are more along the lines of the Canadian vision
Well,
of
I
that.
like Canada, Steve.
Okay, well, we're delighted to hear it. And you sent one of your sons to McGill University,
That's
did
right.
you not?
That's right.
So you must like Canada a bit.
Yeah. And I was a little disappointed that he didn't take out Canadian citizenship.
It's not too late.
Yeah.
It's not too late. We're really grateful you made some time for us at TVO tonight. That's John A. Powell, all lowercase, from the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.